Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining this very interesting workshop. I'm going to try and talk a bit about national approaches to fostering IPv6 deployment that seem to have borne fruit in the hope that others might learn some lessons here. My first few slides will seem quite familiar by now. The global picture of IPv6 deployment is quite a diverse one. India has already been identified as the standout #1 source of IPv6 traffic globally, and as Paul mentioned, that's more or less exclusively down to a single operator who built a greenfield network and decided that from day one, that would be IPv6 only. That's an opportunity for people deploying greenfield networks, not all networks, obviously, but Reliance Jio really setting the standard there. And it's a similar approach that other operators have taken where they have the opportunity, like Sky Italia is a recent example in Europe, where they have also chosen to go down that route. So looking at Europe, again, a similar picture, very diverse. Interestingly, some of the countries in Europe with the most IPv6 deployment are the countries in the world with the most IPv6 deployment, India except. So whilst the landscape is fractured and diverse here, it is also in some respects a leader. So I thought I'd just highlight some of the top and the bottom of the diversity here. And I think this also shows that it's nothing to do really with Western Europe or Eastern Europe or relatively wealthy or relatively less wealthy countries. The diversity is very hard to pin down to one single factor. But what I will try and do is just through a couple of case studies, highlight what seem to have been some of the factors that helped IPv6 deployment in these countries. So after India, Belgium is the #1 for IPv6 deployment in Europe and worldwide. And the key stimulus there really, I think, is the shortage of IPv4 addresses that has also stimulated a number of private businesses like Facebook and others to deploy IPv6. But interestingly, also limits on the ability to which carrier grade NAT or CGN could be deployed as a workaround to the lack of IPv4 addresses meant that there was a very strong stimulus to deploy IPv6 as a means to address the growing network in Belgium. And there the IPv6 Council provided a forum for operators and engineers to share their experiences and their roadmaps for IPv6 deployment and build a spirit of collaboration really across otherwise competing businesses to get this job done. But even despite that, today, mobile networks are still lagging here, which is in some ways surprising because in other regions like North America, India, and other countries, mobile networks are in the vanguard of IPv6 deployment. So again, it's hard to say, oh, well, that's understandable because it's really not. But I think a lesson to draw here is that the collaborative competition between the operators facing a similar challenge really helped, and the regulatory impetus gave them all the encouragement they needed. Another country that I'm more familiar with is the United Kingdom. And again, here, IPv6 deployment has grown rapidly over the last 5 years. And the IPv6 Council here has also played a similar role. They have a very diverse core team made up of representatives from ISPs, content providers, enterprises, and research and education networks. It's not a legally incorporated body. They're all volunteers relying on sponsorship from industry and hosts to deliver free public events and provide an online curated archive of valuable information and insight into how people are deploying IPv6, what challenges they're facing, and how they're overcoming those. Now, Sky in the UK have deployed dual stack to 5 million residential users. BT are also deploying dual stack. The mobile operator EE has deployed to millions of mobile users, again, IPv6 only using 464 XLAT transition technology. The IPv6 Council in the UK mentions that security topics draw the biggest audience, which is an interesting shift. So they're no longer talking about how do we do this, what are the obstacles, should we even do this anyway, what are the incentives. They've moved up the stack, if you will, of problems, and they're now more focused on dealing with the operational issues that arise when you're running a V6 network. I've recently written quite extensively and spoken to some of the local regulators. I thought I'd mention Saudi Arabia, where there's been really dramatic growth in IPv6 deployment very recently, and they're now a leader in IPv6 adoption in the Middle East. Again, they're driven by the regulator forming a task force made up of a mixture of service providers and key institutions. So again, this notion of a multi-stakeholder approach to tackling the problem of IPv6 deployment comes to the fore. They began by developing their strategy, focusing on core networks, the CCTLD, and building up training for the engineers in the region. And then they started publishing best practices and guidance for their public organizations and private organizations about how to best deploy IPv6. That got them so far, but by 2018, the awareness started to grow that Saudi was really falling behind in comparison to global adoption rates. And I personally find that quite gratifying as somebody who works on publishing global adoption rates and per country adoption rates. It's nice to know that these sort of league tables do start to serve as a bit of a forcing function, at least to the extent that people care about how they look in comparison to their neighbors. And so they redoubled their efforts, started holding more regular meetings, and interestingly formalized regular key performance indicators. So really starting to regularly measure themselves and the progress of IPv6 deployment in Saudi Arabia against their neighbors and against the global average. And many times they mentioned the assistance of RIPE NCC with case studies from other operators and workshops, allowing them to discuss their challenges openly and learn from others both within and beyond the region. As you can see from the graph, the solutions that they identified early last year have had a dramatic impact, and it's now plain to see in adoption measurements that Saudi is a leader in the region. In conclusion, there are a number of factors that seem to help. I mean, obviously the shortage of IPv4 addresses is a strong incentive, and regulation that limits the extent to which operators can share IPv4 addresses across subscribers compounds those shortages, which also furthers the incentive to deploy IPv6. But really, I think it's the formation of collaborative and that notion of competitive entities coming together to collaborate in an environment with good information sharing that comes across from these various case studies. The multi-stakeholder approach is important to involve not just the ISPs, but the content providers, the hosting providers, the R&E networks, and anyone really with an interest and willing to work on the problem. The information sharing, as I've mentioned, is key, publishing best current practices, helping people with things like addressing plans and dealing with the differences in terms of securing IPv6 networks versus IPv4 networks. Another thing that can help is vetted groups for information sharing between engineering teams, perhaps using a Chatham House rule. That allows people really to ask questions about whether things they don't understand, problems they're running into, without those issues becoming front page news. Regular meetings using the tools available to observe the impact of their actions and the international shifts in traffic, and documenting and sharing their experiences and wins to encourage others. There's really no obstacle to IPv6 deployment today in terms of technical obstacles. It's really just down to political will, engineering will, and getting the job done. Thank you very much.